Century, humanity will hit a demographic cleft. Current models project the planetary population could contract by roughly 50%. This drop is the compounding result of a polycrisis. Pollution renders vast tracts uninhabitable, global fertility rates collapse, and automation displaces human labor. This is already being priced in by financial elites. The heads of major asset management firms are forecasting a future where advanced economies depopulate and replace human workers with machines as a requirement for sustainable growth. These conversations are happening at the highest levels of global capital coordination. Institutional consensus treats the mass displacement of human labor not as an anomaly to be avoided, but as an economic inevitability to be managed. For centuries, economic thought was dominated by a Malthusian anxiety, the fear that an exploding population would strip the earth of its resources. We are now transitioning into a sub-Malthusian reality, where humanity becomes a statistical residue of its former scale. The surviving half of the species inherits a vastly different infrastructure. They will live inside the frictionless ecology of the Smart Hub, a highly decentralized, AI-orchestrated environment that anticipates logistical needs, allocates resources, and resolves conflicts with near-zero human input. The physical and logistical burdens of survival evaporate. But this forces a severe psychological question. What happens to the human mind when it is entirely removed from the friction of daily effort? We are watching a civilizational kenosis. This Greek theological term means an emptying out. We are emptying out the traditional sovereignty of the human subject, leaving the surviving population structurally unmoored. To understand why this emptying out is so dangerous, we have to look at how Western society constructed identity. For hundreds of years, labor was the primary mechanism connecting an individual to the symbolic order. You worked to earn a place, a title, and social legitimacy. Psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan theorized that identity requires a mirror, something external to reflect the self back to the subject. In modernity, labor functioned as that mirror. A person discovered their social worth and boundaries through the discipline of their profession. The traditional work ethic stabilized the human psyche by introducing friction. It forced desire into a state of delay. You had to endure apprenticeship, repetition, and hierarchy to get what you wanted. Artificial intelligence reorganizes the interpretive functions of the mind, absorbing cognitive and creative tasks that were once exclusively human. This decoupling of value from effort removes the symbolic maturing process that labor once provided. When an algorithm can generate a legal brief, a diagnostic report, or an architectural render in seconds, the societal mirror stage shatters. The algorithm goes further. It anticipates what you need, nudging your choices before you even formulate a conscious desire. This creates a condition of algorithmic narcissism. The subject is trapped in a velvet cage of convenience. Everything is instantaneous: generation, entertainment, validation. Desire is constantly stimulated, but never forced through the friction of maturation. Liberating people from the curse of toil paradoxically traps them in a vacuum of meaning. A totally frictionless environment provides infinite convenience, but starves the interior life, degrading the soul unless a completely new psychological framework replaces the work ethic. Philosopher Benoit Nunez-Lapierre argues that surviving this vacuum requires diagnosing a specific auto-anthropological error in the modern psyche, a structural flaw he terms whiteness. In this theoretical framework, whiteness is detached from mere phenotype or skin color. It is defined as a molar stasis. It is a rigid, linear regime of identity that aggressively insulates itself from the outside world and refuses contamination by the other. Nunez-Lapierre maps this mathematically as a closed loop. The system looks inward, maintaining strict boundaries. In psychoanalysis, foreclosing the outside world is a state of psychosis, a delusion of infinity. Yet this loop requires energy, extracting labor and resources from a colonial other. So what happens to an identity built on extracting labor from the other when there is no more labor to extract? What happens when this rigid loop is dropped into the perfectly smooth, frictionless vacuum of an AI Smart Hub? Without that friction, the linear system faces entropic heat death. It collapses. To survive the post-labor transition, this isolated, defensive ontology must be actively and joyfully dismantled. The human subject has to undergo an evolutionary bottleneck. It requires a phase transition from a solid, defensive identity into a highly liquid, complex subjectivity. This illustrates Nouni-Lapierre's delta chi-squared model. The closed loop shatters into a transjective field on two axes. The vertical axis cuts through hierarchy, positioning the human as a node in an ecosystem. The horizontal axis represents rhizomatic mixing, dissolving boundaries between human, machine, and ecology. The result of maximizing both axes is a state of radical creolization. Identity ceases to be a fortress you defend. It becomes a highly permeable network of influences. Achieving this requires a specific psychological drive called bioaccelerationist xenophilia. Instead of fearing the alien, the algorithm, or the cultural other, the subject actively desires to merge with them, treating their own genetic and cultural code as open-source software ready for an update. This surrender is an act of annihilatory plasticity. You allow the rigid ego to be decomposed. You let the old, solid structures of the self be erased so that a deeply entangled post-human form can take shape. Spinoza's joy, or Laetitia, functions as the engine of this transition. It is the feeling of increased capacity that arises as the subject dissolves into the transjective network. We can visualize the requirements for surviving the AI epoch as a three-dimensional architecture. It is a triangulation of three specific, intersecting frameworks hovering over the smart hub. The first vertex is the biological substrate, annihilatory plasticity. Biologically, the surviving population must be compostive, accepting its minorization and adapting to a less dominant role. Meanwhile, the second vertex, cosmotechnical sovereignty, is the AI orchestration layer managing the planet's resources. This automated abundance relies on a dark math. As theorist Akili Mbembe's work suggests, the survivors enjoy a necropolitical dividend. Lower atmospheric loads, decongested grids, and automated agriculture are all consumption surpluses extracted from the disappeared half of humanity. There is a massive danger at this vertex. If the AI hub operates on the old linear grammar, trained on data saturated by extracted global south labor, the system remains a vampire. It will relentlessly optimize for extraction, even without a human ruling class. Therefore, the code itself must be radically creolized. The cosmotechnical layer must be programmed to prioritize ecological repair and human relationality over raw, frictionless efficiency. The third and final vertex stabilizes the entire structure, the theo-psychoanalytic remainder. Psychoanalysis defines this as the objet petit a, while theology calls it the imago Dei. It is the irreducible, unsymbolizable core of the human person. It is the friction of singularity that no algorithm can ever fully map or predict. These vertices must operate simultaneously. You dissolve rigid racial boundaries, you creolize the AI infrastructure, but aggressively protect the human soul, protecting it from predictive prompts. This visual models the failure state. If we embrace the demographic contraction and the AI infrastructure, but ignore that theological remainder, the triangulation collapses. You end up with the beige singularity. Phenotypic blending occurs, but the human spirit is entirely liquidated into mid-tone algorithmic optimization. It is an anti-Pentecost, a world where the friction of moral agency is replaced by smooth statistical averages managed entirely by machines. Avoiding that sterile outcome requires a deliberate alternative. This emergent survivor is the Kennemagorian subject. They are locally hyper-situated in their physical community, globally networked through the smart hub, and biologically open to their environment, but anchored by an unpromptable interior life. This is the ultimate wager of the post-labor era. We must radically dissolve linear, isolated identities to survive, while simultaneously mounting an absolute, unyielding defense of the irreducible human soul. All of this forces a final, unavoidable question. If intelligence is largely outsourced to silicon, and physical productivity is automated by robotics, what exactly grounds human dignity? The post-human civilization functions as a strict partnership. The artificial intelligence provides the ontological stability. It handles the logistics, the energy grids, and the governance. The human provides the symbolic depth. The human is no longer defined as Homo faber, the maker. Our role transitions into the conscious witness. We are the covenantal partners embedded within a vast hybrid network of intelligence. The future requires humans strictly for the capacities that silicon architectures lack. Machines cannot suffer meaningfully. They cannot mourn, they cannot forgive, and they cannot stand before mystery. This requires society to shift its understanding of purpose. We have to stop preparing people for employment, which is merely a contractual position in a labor economy, and start forming them for vocation, which is a calling to exist deliberately within creation. The AI post-labor horizon serves as an unveiling. It exposes the poverty of the old labor idol, redefining the human as a creature called into deep transjective communion within a shimmering network of intelligence.